Hey everybody, my name's Derek. Welcome to How to Run a Mechanical Ventilator. Today I'm going to guide you through understanding what is in a mechanical ventilation mode, what kind of the parameters are. We're going to talk about initial settings and modes, both in a book context and also a real-world context. And we're also going to talk about assessment and troubleshooting your patient on a mechanical ventilator. And real quick, this is going to be one long video, but I'm going to break it up into multiple easily digestible parts so that it's not just like a super long upload. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first of all, with any kind of ventilator, you're going to have some kind of interface. This is using the Hamilton VenTrainer app, which is on PC, it might be on Mac OS as well, I'm not sure, but it's also on Android and iOS. It's a good resource for kind of simulating different ventilators. So in here, that was weird, my mouse got big for a second. So in here, we have basically a standard Hamilton ventilator. Now, no matter what, every ventilator is going to have a different interface, but you should see a few things. You should see a place to select modes. You should see a place for settings, or this calls it controls. You should see something for alarms. There should be some kind of EST or pre-op check, pre-use check, right? You'll have something, some kind of screen for that here. And then you should also have some like patient information, like putting in their IBW and height, that kind of stuff. And once again, they're all ventilators are going to be different. They're going to look different, but they're all going to have these things, right? Now, first of all, I'm going to pull up the modes. We're going to talk about this first video is going to be what's in a mode. Now, we will talk about the initial settings, and I'm sure all of you are aware, whether you're a student or an RRT, there is a really big difference between the school world and the real world. I already kind of said I'm going to talk a little bit about both. So, starting mode, what do we pick? Well, first of all, we need a bit of a basic understanding of what each mode is. And in order to understand each mode, we really have to understand the taxonomy, or in simple terms, the naming scheme of ventilator modes. So, what's in a name? What is a mode made up of? Well, there are two things we must first understand. We must understand the four primary variables during mechanical ventilation, and also the types of breaths. You combine the four primary variables with the type of breaths in order to create the mode, basically. So I'm going to break down each variable. Variable 1 is trigger. Now, this is the parameter that starts the inspiratory phase, or what will trigger a breath, right? There are 2 categories of triggers and 5 types of triggers. For the categories, you have patient triggers and machine triggers. And then for the types, first you have the flow trigger. Now, this is usually kind of the default trigger. And basically, there's a flow running through the ventilator circuit at all time. We call this bias flow, and the ventilator is able to measure how much flow comes out of one side and goes back in through the other. Now, with a flow trigger, the ventilator will deliver a breath whenever the patient draws in a certain amount of flow from the circuit. The vent will detect that less flow is returning to the other side, and it will deliver a breath. So obviously this is a kind of patient trigger. Flow trigger is often seen as the more comfortable trigger type and the easiest for a patient to initiate a breath with. Then you have the pressure trigger. Now with this one, the ventilator is trying to detect a drop in airway pressure in order to deliver a breath. This is a bit harder for the patient to initiate than with flow trigger, so it's not usually the primary one we choose. Then there's volume trigger, which I've actually never heard of before, but I know like some of the books, like the Kettering book, brings it up, so I figured I'd mention it. With this trigger, the vent is basically looking for a change of volume within the circuit in order to deliver a breath. I've never seen a vent that utilizes volume trigger. I honestly don't even know if that's a real thing, but once again, it's here. And of course, it is also a patient trigger. Then we have time trigger. In this case, you set a respiratory rate, or in some vents, you'll have an I to E ratio, or I time, E time, that kind of thing. And basically, the ventilator is going to automatically deliver a breath on a set time interval. For example, at a mandatory rate of 10, there's going to be one breath delivered every 6 seconds. That's a machine trigger, of course. The final type is manual triggered. In this case, you can push a button on the vent for a manual breath at any time. This is also a machine trigger. Variable 2 is the control or target variable. This is either going to be volume or pressure. You can have volume control VC or pressure control PC. You can have pressure support, which is sometimes called spontaneous or CPAP, or volume support. This is the variable that the ventilator will attempt to achieve, such as a set volume of 500 in volume control or a set inspiratory pressure of 14 in pressure control. Variable 3 is your limit variable. This establishes a maximum value that some variable can reach during inspiration. Usually this is pressure for the most part. Now say in volume control mode, you've got a peak pressure alarm, right? Now even though the ventilator will attempt to deliver a volume, if the peak pressure reaches the value that you set in your alarm, then the ventilator is going to limit the pressure and the targeted volume will not be reached. But do notice that this is a limit, not a cycling mechanism, meaning that reaching the limit does not end the inspiratory phase, it just causes a plateau, right? The ventilator is still going to be in inspiration, but it's just going to basically plateau that pressure and it's not going to go above it. And because it's plateauing the pressure, your volume is not going to get reached, right? Now variable 4, this is your cycle variable. The cycle variable is what will end the breath, or in other words, cycle the ventilator from inspiration to expiration. The first type of cycle is volume cycle. In this case, the ventilator will deliver flow and exert a pressure to reach a certain volume, and once that volume is reached, the ventilator will then cycle into expiration. This is the typical cycling method for volume control mode, but as we said, if your breath is pressure limited by a high pressure, then you will never reach the targeted volume and it's never going to cycle into expiration, right? So there must be a backup cycling mechanism in volume control. And yes, indeed, there is. Meet our second cycling variable, which is pressure cycle. In pressure cycle, flow is applied until a certain pressure is reached. Once that pressure is hit, the ventilator will cycle into expiration. This is the backup cycling method for volume-controlled, pressure-limited ventilation, right? You hit that pressure limit, and then it's going to end up pressure cycling as well because it can no longer volume cycle. The third type of cycle is time cycle. So in this type, flow is applied and pressure is exerted for a preset amount of time, also known as your I time. Once this time is reached, the ventilator will cycle into expiration. This is the normal cycling method for pressure control modes. And the final cycling variable is flow cycle. With flow cycle, a preset pressure is applied until inspiratory flow drops below a certain preset value, usually a percentage. Once inspiratory flow drops to set preset percentage of peak inspiratory flow, the vent will cycle into exhalation. This is used in spontaneous pressure support modes. The name of the setting in spont modes varies from one vent to another, just like the names of the modes themselves, but I can tell you from experience that on the servos, it's called end inspiratory percent, and on Hamilton's, it's called ETS. So basically, it's how quickly you're cutting off their breath, right? When they're inhaling, the flow starts dropping. It's like at what percentage of peak flow do you cut off the breath and go to exhalation? That's basically what it is. So now I'm going to talk about the 3 types of breaths delivered. As you probably know, there are 3 types of breaths. You have mandatory, assisted, and spontaneous. Now, mandatory breaths are triggered by the ventilator and controlled by the ventilator, right? They're probably going to be like a time trigger, and then it's going to be like a volume control or something along those lines. Assisted breaths are triggered by the patient but controlled by the ventilator. So that's going to be like a flow triggered breath that is then volume control or pressure control, right? And spontaneous breaths are triggered by the patient and controlled by the patient. That's going to be your spontaneous pressure support, or CPAP mode. So putting that together, you can have control mode, which honestly doesn't exist anymore, but I'll mention it for the sake of being complete. You can have AC or assist control mode, where the ventilator will give mandatory breaths, but the patient is also free to trigger assisted breaths. And spontaneous mode, where there are no mandatory breaths, but there is usually some kind of backup rescue mode in case the patient goes apneic. And then you also have hybrid modes, such as SIMV, also known as synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, and that's a mode where there are mandatory breaths, assisted breaths, and spontaneous breaths. Now, I'm not going to go any more in depth into SIMV than that for now, but I will make a video trashing SIMV in the future because honestly, it's not a good mode. But for now, that's not the place, not the time. So now let's put it together. So you can put the type of control mode and the types of breaths given together, and you can get combinations like PCAC, VCSIMV, and that's where the mode names come from. The trigger, limit, and cycle variables will either be set within settings for each mode or intrinsically just part of each mode. However, there's also a third part of the taxonomy of ventilator modes separate from breath types and control variables, which is the targeting scheme. Now, what the heck is the targeting scheme? Well, look, I'm not really going to get into crazy detail here. Not to say that targeting scheme isn't important, but it's a more complex thing to describe, and so I'm going to reserve that for future videos. But just know that ventilators can do some other things in the background to reach certain targets beyond just the volume or the pressure control. And one such example that is PRVC, which is also not a very good mode, which I will also touch on in future videos. But with PRVC, it's essentially a volume control, but it's trying to mess with the flow to get a lower pressure delivered, basically. Well, not even lower pressure delivered, but more like a lower peak pressure. But we'll just leave it at that. Now moving on, we can now classify most modes as being either pressure or volume controlled, either mandatory, spontaneous, or both, and sometimes throwing on extra little targets on top of the control parameter, like with PRVC. So now let's go back and take a look at the Hamilton again. So if you've never worked with a Hamilton before, you might look at this ventilator and be like, what is going on? None of these modes look like anything that you just told me about. This is completely different. Well, welcome to the world of marketing, where nothing is consistent. Every ventilator tries to make it sound like its modes are better than the other, and it's all actually the same stuff, but it just makes it more confusing for you. The simple truth is that each manufacturer of ventilators uses different naming schemes. Some do rely on the basic AC, PC, VC, SIMV format, but others do not. And Hamilton, with all of its marketing power, likes to be different. I will translate these modes for you, but just know that if you come across ventilators where you don't understand what the mode means, the best thing you can do is simply look up what their modes mean in layman's terms. They should have some kind of manual or translation guide somewhere. That's what I did, and that's, you know, the Hamilton website actually has that, so that's actually what I did. So, okay, up here we have APV, CMV, APV, SIMV, SCMV, SIMV, and these are volume-controlled adaptic. Then we have pressure-controlled biphasic, PCV, PSIMV, SPONT, DuoPAP, APRV. You know, then we have intelligent ventilation, whatever the heck that means, and non-invasive. Okay, so up here, APV. What does APV mean, right? So that means PRVC, essentially. It's an adaptive thing. It's basically PRVC. Okay. CMV in this case is not the book CMV. It just means volume control, right? So this is PRVC. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean volume control, but it kind of does. I think it's meant to kind of mean AC in this context, as in this is PRVC AC, this is PRVC SIMV, but then over here that simply means volume control. This is straight up volume control. And then this is just VCSIMV. Terrible, terrible naming scheme. Shame on you, Hamilton. You're tricking people into using PRVC on purpose. That's just really bad. Nobody should use PRVC. It sucks. And then here we have our pressure controlled modes. PCV plus, this is just PCAC. PSIMV plus, that's just PCSIMV. Spontaneous is obviously just like a pressure support or CPAP mode. APRV is APRV, that's an advanced mode. I'll talk about at some point in the future. Duopap, I have no idea what that means. Looking at the settings when you go in there, to me it looks like APRV, but I guess somehow it's different. Who cares? It doesn't matter for the point of this video. You're not going to use it, and I'm not either.